Alireza Firouzja hasn't just been beating his opponents in 2021, he's been destroying them. And in this game, we're going to see an absolute demolition job that he did on the strong Hungarian grandmaster, Rapport. This was played in Norway Chess this year. Firouzja had white and Rapport had black. So Firouzja kicks off with his favourite e4, and we had a Sicilian on board from Rapport. We had knight to f3 now, knight to c6, and bishop b5, so the start of the Rosiglio variation. Now there's so many moves black can play here. Queen to b6, pawn to d6, g6, e6. Rapport decides to go with knight f6 here, a slightly less common move, but not a bad move at all. Knight to c3 now from Firouzja, and now we had knight d4 from Rapport. Again, not the most common move, but it has been seen before. So white's getting some rapid development here, but black for his part is going to try and pick up the two bishops and then hold firm. So Firouzja responds with the main move here, which is pawn to e5. So he gives up the bishop pair, which Rapport now takes. Knight recaptures, and this now allows this knight to jump into d5 because the c3 knight has moved away. So we had castles now from Firouzja. He could have also considered playing knight to g5 here, setting up ideas of bringing the queen to f3 to pressure f7 and also hit this knight on d5. So black has to be really careful in these positions. Instead, Firouzja plays castles, which is another solid move. We had a6 now from black, and Firouzja actually plays pawn to c4 here. This has been seen before, counter-attacking on the knight. You can retreat the knight here, but then you're kind of giving black what he wants. So after this recapture, if black can now stabilise with moves like d6, pawn to g6, develop the bishops and castle, then black has the bishop pair and a steady pawn structure here. So you're not really gaining an advantage there as white. So that's why Firouzja goes pawn to c4. So Rapport played the knight into b4. Just briefly, you don't want to drop back to b6 attacking this, because white can actually ignore that threat, drop his own knight back, and if you take, white's getting a massive lead in development and you just can't go for this, it's too dangerous. So that's why knight b4. We had knight to c3 now, pawn to d6. Firouzja now goes pawn to d4, ripping open the centre here and trying to play with this lead in development. So Rapport plays the standard capture on d4 now, and Firouzja plays an excellent move here. Queen takes d4, giving Rapport an exchange, which he duly accepts with knight to c2. We have queen to e4, knight takes in the corner, and bishop f4. So Firouzja said after the game that this actually wasn't preparation, it just came to him in the game, and how could he possibly be worse here? And you can see what he means with this massive lead in development that he's got, and look at the black pieces, all stuck on the back rank still. So Rapport now scrambles to develop with bishop to e6. It's an ugly looking move because you're running into knight g5s here, but the problem is if black tries to play e6 then he blocks that bishop. If he tries to play g6 then we can take and the pawn is pinned, so he's kind of struggling for moves here. So Firouzja now picks up the knight in the corner. We have rook to c8 from Rapport hitting this pawn, and arguably Firouzja should go b3 here just to solidify that. Instead, he immediately jumps in the knight, which is very much his style. But this did allow Rapport some counter punches now, so he took on e5 here, and after the knight recaptures, although these knights look beautiful, Rapport had a counter shot here. He could have taken on c4, and for example, say the queen recaptures, then we can take with the queen in the centre here. We've given back an exchange, but we are still a pawn up as black. And if we can solidify here, we've also got the bishop pair. White could maybe check, but then you can always interpose with the queen. So it's still tricky for black to unravel, but they might be sneaking out in this variation. Anyway, this didn't happen in the game. Rapport did take on e5 like this, the knight recaptured, but then he played pawn to f6, kicking this knight away, but now exposing this diagonal, which is the downside of that move. So Firouzja drops the knight back, and Rapport now goes wrong here. He takes the knight on d5 and the pawn recaptures. He arguably should have been playing something like king to f7 just to at least try and start the process of bringing the king to safety and somehow getting these pieces out. But after the bishop took the knight, the pawn recaptured, Rapport now followed up with rook to c5, and although you can see his intentions, it's just not working tactically, because after d6 now, Firouzja's really starting to rip open some fatal lines. You can't take this pawn because it's pinned, and if you push e5, this is just fatal. So you can start by playing b4 to kick the rook away from this rank. Say the rook tries to stay on the rank, then you go a4, and if the rook retreats to say c6, well, now you can simply chop this pawn with say knight takes. Either capture is good, to be honest, and after recapture we take with the queen, and the black king is just in all sorts of trouble. There's too many pieces in the attack, the rook is coming across, and black can't survive this. So coming back here, after d6, Rapport instead tried queen to d7, just trying to batten down the hatches and hold on to the b7 pawn. We had pawn to b4 now from Firouzja anyway to kick the rook away, and the rook should really drop back to the back rank here. But instead Rapport goes rook to c6, and you can see why he's playing for this. We now had rook to e1, bringing more firepower to the attack, and now the king sidesteps with king to f7. So Firouzja plays knight d4 here, hitting the rook. Now we had pawn to e5, but again we have a check now on d5, we kick the king away, and then we simply take that pawn, not minding that we're giving up bishop for pawn here, because the attack is just overwhelming. So a beautiful shot by Firouzja. Rapport actually realised the danger of capturing here, so after the capture you can just drop back to f3, and the threat of taking this pawn with the knight and forking all of these things is just too deadly in combination with the queen and the rook coming in. So instead Rapport doesn't go in for this. After the bishop captured, he took on d6 here. Firouzja now takes that rook, we have bishop takes, and now the queen drops in and gives this check. The king drops back to f7, we have queen d5 check, and you can't drop back to f8 here, or else you're running into this knight check on e6, which just has deadly consequences with lots of discoveries coming. So coming back here, the king has to come back into g6, and now Firouzja just takes a really nice time out of the attack to play pawn to g3. We note that if he say played rook to d1 immediately, which is what he played in the game, then black has the shot, bishop takes on h2, and we're picking up the queen. So that's why he goes g3 here to protect against that. And the problem for black here is you just can't unravel. If you try queen to c7 to break this pin behind the bishop, now white can just jump in with queen to f5 check, and after king f7, queen e6 check. The king can't step to f8, or else we come in with a checkmate on e8 here. And if the king steps to g6, then we check on g4 this time, and after dropping back to f7, now we come in here with the knight, and we're forking both queen on c7 and a check threat with queen and knight on g7. So these are the big problems for black. The king is just too exposed, there's too many white pieces attacking. So after Firouzja played this g3 move, that's why Rapport tried h6 to help the king run away, but now we had rook to d1 from Firouzja, adding more pressure to this file. We had rook to e8 now, preparing to swing into e6 and defend the bishop, but now simply knight to f3, rook to e6, and now knight h4 check, king drops back, and queen d3 was the final move of the game, because after the king moves away, the knight is jumping in, and this bishop can't be saved. Note that Firouzja doesn't play knight f5 first, or else then black can go rook e5, forking these two pieces. So an awesome demolition job from Firouzja there. If you want to see him destroying Magnus Carlsen, then click here, and subscribe to the channel, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.